All right. Well, welcome back. Here we are for our last lecture, right? Uh, Again, I hope you and all your families are still well and safe and during these trying times and managing without too much distress. Mhm. Um, it is certainly a different world at the moment, and who knows, by the time you see this lecture, my restrictions may have been lightened, if not lifted, hopefully at least lightened, if not lifted. All right, and things are getting better and returning to our new normal. Okay, so moving on, the last lectures, chapter 14 and 15, paraphilic disorders and atypical sexual behaviors, and prostitution and pornography. Exciting topics. So, and that's what I said. After this, next week is your last exam, and we've made it through the semester. Okay. So, I'm going to pause. Sorry, I had to stop for a second and get the screens set up. So, back to the slideshow, right? So here we go. I'm going to open up chapter 14 and get started. Paraphilic disorders and atypical sexual behaviors, or sexual behaviors we do not consider the norm. Okay, so it looks like a voyeur right there, but it's hard to tell from a snapshot. Anyway, so we're going to talk about how the DSM describes paraphilia and paraphilic disorders, diagnoses, etc., and how we judge and look at these types of behaviors, why they seem more common in men than women, and how they're developed and how they can be reconciled if necessary. The difference between victim and non-victimizing disorders, those arguments, of course. Can you talk about, this probably should have been in the last chapter about the Catholic Church and their sexual abuse. Evaluate. And we'll talk about some treatments and their effectiveness. So this, the earliest type of recording, of the scientific recording of pathological behaviors, or study what they consider pathological behaviors, was 1886, right? 150 years ago almost, or 135 years ago, whatever that is. Some of which today are normal behaviors, right? But they weren't then. Right? So it's very different. Society grows and changes. What we consider normal changes. We've talked about that before. So we're going to talk about the APA, the American Psychological Association, and how they deal with that. So, paraphilias, the group in the DSM, and as a group, have some criteria, right? That they have to be sexually arousing. The behavior has to be compulsive, meaning you don't have much, person doesn't have much control over it. And of course, then it has to be pathological. And by that, we mean that, right, most people would consider this behavior deviant. So here we go. Does something meet the criteria? Is it for sexual arousal or gratification? That's a no. The same three categories. So we're going to talk about specific paraphilias, right? So in the DSM-5, there are 9 specified diagnoses, right? Voyeuristic disorder, exhibitionist disorder, frotteuristic disorder, which means typically happens in public, subways, buses, movie theater, crowded spaces where people rub up against people without their consent. All right, um, they touch people when they get the opportunity in a situation. And then there's masochism, sadism, pedophilia, fetishistic disorder, and transvestic disorder. Those are the nine specified ones. Then there is also what we call other paraphilic disorders or unspecified paraphilic disorders. Those are categories included in most of the disorders. So others are things that are not as common, and so they group them into one category, like necrophilia, unophobia, and a number of others. And then the unspecified means that there's some pathological behavior going on that doesn't quite fit into any of the other categories, but certainly meets the criteria for some type of disorder. Okay. And so here's the list, right? I guess I could have waited. We're going to go talk some of them a little bit more and some not so much, but here is what we talk about. Say something that I didn't mention, right? Zoophilia is, right, a other category, right? Gerontophilia, have the desire to have sex with older people, being treated as an infant, right? Necrophilia with corpses, longer list of things than I had first addressed. Okay. Sexual addiction is not a paraphilic disorder, right? It's an addiction disorder, which is a different category according to the EPA and in the DSM. Addictions have to do with drugs, gambling, sex, those type of things. A different type of behavior. Okay. So how do we judge as a society, judge something to be a paraphilia? Obviously, it's destructive, illegal, interferes with having appropriate adult relationships, and involves typically if the other person is not consenting to the behavior. Like I said about brushing up against people in the bus, etc. Men, why is mostly men, and we think to believe again, as usual, that men's sex drive is stronger than women's is really not appropriate. However, men are allowed to have greater latitude when it comes to their sexual thoughts, talks, actions, etc. They're not looked down upon for sexual freedoms that women are necessarily. That's not to say that women do not partake in these behaviors. And then, of course, we've talked before about how sexual data is difficult to come up with valid data all the time, and it's often biased by self-report and other things, right? So we talked about Freud a couple last week and his theories, right, and childhood, and all across the board, how your childhood affects your adult behavior, nurturing. But Freud, as I said, back then, right, most people do not follow Freud's beliefs any longer. However, conditioning is part of the problem. So the behavioral theory, so the psychodynamic theory is Freud's, right? And the behavioral theory is, something happened that gave me sexual pleasure, and so I continue to search for that, to recreate that event. I saw somebody having sex and I enjoyed it, so now voyeurism is part of my repertoire. That's one of the things that I enjoy, right? I was when I was a small child and I was spanked, I got sexual pleasure. It aroused me sexually, and so I become a masochist. That type of conditioning reinforcement, right? Uh, how we do it, or I'm rewarded for a sexual behavior, and I find that of some kind. Uh, at any rate, I have a positive consequence due to some type of action, and then that turns into my paraphilia. Mhm. Right. So you accidentally see, as I said, you see something, whether by accident or on purpose, and then you get sexually aroused, and then voyeurism is part of your sexual behavior. Mhm. And then, of course, there is the biological theory, right? It has to do with hormones. So here we go: nature versus nurture versus nurture, right? The ongoing battle, or the ongoing discussion of how we develop as human beings. Still trying to get my morning caffeine. So this is looking at predators, sexual predators, and how did I get? I don't think I should be this here. Right? Sorry, I haven't keeping up on my notes with the slides. I want to go back for a minute and talk about, so just like gender, right? This is a development, and as we get our gender identity, you get your sexual pleasure identity of some type, right? And again, nature versus nurture. Here we go among, I was going to start talking about pedophiles on victory. So convicted pedophiles produce more adrenaline during when they're sexually excited than the average person. And so that's one of the nature pieces people look at. We already talked about this. Oh, so the three, right? So I said psychodynamic, behavioral, and biological. Typically nothing so black and white, right? You can't compartmentalize. It's just one thing or another. It's usually some type of combination of events and biology and all those things. So any of those, if you're an eclectic, typically what we call an eclectic psychologist or therapist of any kind, then you would use any piece of any of those that helps you help your client. It doesn't matter. You don't stick to one school of thought. You use the tool that's most effective at the moment, no matter what school of thought it comes from. So we're going to talk about paraphilic disorders that victimize people and those that don't. So when we look at victimizing disorders, of course, voyeuristic disorders, watching others engage in sexual activity, or what the voyeur considers sexual activity, and victimizes somebody without their knowledge, right? As opposed to an exhibitionist disorder who, when somebody flashes you, you're certainly aware of it, I would hope. They're going to make you aware of it, otherwise it doesn't help them. The fraternalistic disorder that we talked about, right? Rubbing up against somebody in a crowded subway or bus, of course, is victimizing that person. Sadism, of course, has a victim. Sometimes, though, as sadomasochism, and bondage and sadomasochism, they are consenting adults. So whether it's considered a victim or not at that point is debatable. Very debatable. Here's a futuristic opportunity. And this man appears to be rubbing his genitals against somebody. It may or may not be true. You never know. But the young lady in this thing does not look happy in the least. And then, of course, certainly victimizing is any kind of pedophilic disorder that works with children and has some type of sexual interaction with children. And then, of course, the huge issue with the Catholic Church years ago, not that long ago, and still continues to this day to uncover some things. But what that did to any great number of people. So here's our sexual abuse rates going down, our physical abuse rates going down, child abuse, child data, of course, child neglect. I don't know why that was included in here, but it was. It remains unsteady, unfortunately, which is often not intentional, but in poverty and people working, it's unable to feed your children. You're unable to clothe your children appropriately. Society views that as neglect. So as I said, commented earlier, right? Sexual masochism may or may not be victimizing. And masochists are sexually aroused by their own pain or bondage, etc., and willing, consenting adults. Autoerotic asphyxiation, this is an occurrence where people choke themselves somehow during masturbation. Of course, the problem is people kill themselves during this process too. So especially because it's alone, right? You're alone masturbating when you do this, as opposed to hypoxia, where a couple engages in choking one another during orgasm, which is a little safer because you have somebody with you. Then, of course, fetishes are seen as non-victimizing. I prefer my sexual arousal comes through objects, shoes, sometimes inanimate objects, right? And sometimes animate objects, like I can be focused on one part of the body that most people don't see as sexual, such as feet and toes is often the focus of that. Lingerie, right? We talked about that. And then we have transvestic disorder, and this may not be in the next version. This may or may not be in the next version of the DSM, right? As we all know, things drop out of the DSM, and as we started in the beginning of the chapter, what in 1886 was seen as pathological behavior is no longer viewed that way. But transvestic disorder, where you gain sexual gratification, men gain sexual gratification by wearing female clothing. Many of whom are heterosexual men who just get excited by wearing female clothing, and they're typically not interested in any in treatment for any kind of behavior. There's a picture I guess I could have left out. So, what about treatment for paraphilic disorders? Well, most of the time it happens with people that are in jail, or people who, like I said, it's only if it makes you uncomfortable or causes you distress that you seek out treatment, or it's causing issues in your relationship, or it's causing some type of sexual dysfunction because you can't move past it. willing participants, right? So except for pedophilia and there is a behavioral interventions, cognitive behavioral interventions that can be used, but for the most part, court-ordered pedophilia is a tough thing to treat, right? So as I said, we can do CBT, some type of psychotherapy, right? We can orgasmic reconditioning, which is a form of CBT. And then, of course, there's drug therapies, as mentioned previously last week, about for pedophiles. Some places still require some type of drug intervention for people who are being released from prison. Pedophiles that are being released from prison, and usually involves the inability to obtain erection and hopefully orgasm. So as we said, for paraphilic disorders, it's not really, there's not a lot of proven effective interventions, and of course, there's not enough research. All right, and there we are, the end of our slideshow for chapter 14. We'll move into chapter 15, and I will. Oh, and so for this part of your journal article, you need to tell me how many specific paraphilic disorders are in the DSM. I had mentioned it earlier. And now we will move on to chapter 15. Okay. Pornography and prostitution. A highlight of some people, right? So this is a huge sexual marketplace. Excuse me. A huge business, billion-dollar businesses around the world, right? Let's see. I'll start the slideshow. So it's prostitution and pornography. There's a nice photo array, but not necessarily why it's included. So we will talk about how the issues surrounding this and what this means. It's a very complex situation, of course. We'll talk about pornography and pornography versus erotica, and how pornography is around in various forms. We'll talk, and let's start with prostitution. All right, so we talk, it's often been said, and long before the discovery of the bathhouse, that prostitution is the world's oldest profession. It started long before that. All right, here's a picture of some of the artifacts they found from over 2,000 years ago, where the artwork certainly showed the sexual nature of the establishments, right? Prostitute versus sex worker. Really not much difference. The sex worker is a term, I guess, that's less derogative, but certainly the job description, unfortunately, is the same for the most part. They change sexual services for virtually anything except other sexual services, right? So money, anything of value. And typically, the world usually and legally defines prostitution as a female providing a service to a male. So we have streetwalkers, right? That's a girl literally just walk the streets, typically called the stroll. There's an area in most towns and cities, including Tracy, whether you want to believe it or not, Maybe not mountain house yet, but as it grows, it's probably something that can and will develop there. However, there's an area in town where you would go to find streetwalkers and engage in their services, as opposed to call girls, who are considered much higher class, have less sex. So streetwalkers often perform any number of acts during the course of a shift. And call girls, of course, earn a lot more money doing a lot less, okay? And they often work for escort services. So there's a lot of escort services, and those escort services are actually, call girls working under the cover of being escorts. So, and then, of course, there are brothel workers, right? So in Nevada, brothels are legal. There are hundreds of them, all kinds of them. And the girls that work there get a share of their fees. The house collects the fees, and actually, I think it says shares fees with the house manager, but I believe it's actually the other way around. And the house shares the fees with what they want with the workers. But it is a little safer situation. Unfortunately, right, streetwalkers are often in danger and beaten, violence involved, less with call girls, and of course, absolutely much less in brothels, at least in the United States. And here is the Shady Lady Brothel in Nevada. It's a huge business, and this the Shady Lady right now includes men, so they may change their name. Male prostitutes, of course, do a lot of. There are tons of male prostitutes. There are tons of transvestites providing prostitution, streetwalking services, etc. And their customers are typically males. And unfortunately, like all streetwalkers, and some often called, not as often as call girls, but many streetwalkers, drugs are a problem. So male hustlers account for more than 1/3 of all prostitution arrests in the United States. So who becomes a prostitute, right? Like, how does somebody decide to become a prostitute? And unfortunately, oftentimes it is due to socioeconomic status, right? Sometimes it is due to abuse situations, right? And all too often it's due to drug use. And of course, prostitutes were sexually active earlier in their life than other people, and oftentimes against their will, as I said. So here among prostitutes, this is sex trade workers, this is what we find. Their first drug use is typically earlier. As I said, most of these things, the onset of things is different. As you can see, though, the IV drug use, heroin, methamphetamines, etc., and regular IV drug use just immediately precede their first prostitution and regular prostitution work. And their sexual activity is usually younger, as you can see across this, as we said. As prostitutes, people choose to move into prostitution, and unfortunately, the answer is often not. Often it's situational, as I said, extremely socioeconomic. Drug addiction is part of it, and then, of course, forced into prostitution. And sex trafficking, runaways are often coerced into becoming prostitution. Streetwalkers toward survival. Young girls run away from smaller towns and end up in big metropolitan areas and are victimized in that way. And of course, drug use is a huge issue, as we pointed out. And then abuse, right, is the other victims of abuse. And of course, this is not contained as a worldwide issue. And sex trafficking and selling of human beings, of course, is into sexual slavery is a huge problem worldwide. And of course, when you either working as a prostitute or engaging in their services as sex workers, your risk for STDs goes up. And of course, as I said, brothel workers are less likely to have an STI. They get more services in that respect. They're treated, they're tested, etc. Call girls again a little bit more selective and not so likely to have unprotected sex. But of course, streetwalkers and transvestites are the biggest transmitters of STIs in the sexual workplace. And here's a picture of a male prostitute. A transvestite who looks like he's apparently working. And this is what I said. Right, so brothel workers are much less likely. So Johns, what we call Johns or tricks, right? People that solicit the services of sex workers. Are mostly your average male, working, employed, married, children, all of that. Your parents, unfortunately. I know you probably didn't want to hear that, but statistically, in a class of 70 people, somebody's father is engaging in activities with a sex worker. So oral sex is obviously the quickest and simplest and least complicated form of sexual activity for a streetwalker. Right? It occurs in the vehicle, and it avoids any complications or attachments, etc. Normally, right? People do get connected to prostitutes emotionally, but it's not certainly not recommended, and it certainly isn't common. So, like I said, there's a lot of talk often about legalizing prostitution and what that means, and places where it's not been legalized, like San Francisco, it's been more decriminalized. In the Bay Area, particularly in San Francisco, where there's actually a union where sex workers can join, but there's little legal action taken against them, and often it's the Johns that get ticketed or cited for the activities. And of course, this debate can be fearsome. Around the world, in places like Denmark and Amsterdam and the Netherlands, prostitution is legal. And here is some picture of some women advertising themselves, looking for business. So when you talk about a definition, so any sexually explicit work deemed obscene. And of course, the definition, like anything, like we've talked about many times, is subjective and wide variety of definitions. The First Amendment has a moral standard that helps us, and the discrimination standard that helps us try to make definitions. But as I said, the Supreme Court has not taken on anything to put a definitive definition in the United States. One person's erotica is another person's pornography. So Movies. So I described the movie with the rape scene, and most people, obviously, those made in the Hindi film business view that as erotica and not pornography. 50 Shades of Grey is typically viewed as erotica, but as I said, when we talked about sexual harassment, it's a personal view of what you decide is pornography versus erotica and what you like or what you appreciate and don't appreciate. There is a lot of, a lot of debate around this as usual, right? And any things, and not that long ago, and, it's just a huge controversy, right? Because it's very individualistic. And so typically, one of the things that people look at are the women in being portrayed as victims versus as consenting adults in a mutual behavior and pleasure. But pornography is made to sexually arouse you, but often the debate is it belittles women and portrays women in an unrealistic fashion. But women get sexually aroused by pornography or sexual scenes as anybody else. And women who get aroused by sex between men and men, or women and women, or men and women, versus males who traditionally want to see their own sexual orientation, whether they be gay or heterosexual, etc. And then, unfortunately, people believe that pornography incites violence and rape. There are some correlation studies that go along with this. Of course, we need more research, right? And that pornography is violence and not sex. And of course, the internet has changed pornography and made it accessible to everyone, whereas prior to that, there used to be movie houses and sex shops that they were strictly contained to that. There was movie theaters that just showed pornography, and there still exist the sex shops that have little booths where you can watch the movies. But the internet changed all that and gave everyone access to porn. And then, of course, there is the problem of child pornography, right? And so, child pornography, of course, is illegal, right? It's a huge business again, unfortunately, and oftentimes you see many arrests, and but the arrests are certainly small in comparison to the amount of it's happening. And again, the internet had a lot to do with this, and made this much more easily acceptable. And of course, pedophiles are the ones to keep this business going. And so, of course, there is the challenges, of course, of fighting child pornography. And that is the end of the topic and the end of our semester. And you have your last exam next week on these last 4 chapters, and then you will be done. Yay, how exciting, right? So here's the note for your chapter 15 journal article. This is Bernie. He belongs to my youngest, and it's still around our house, even though she is not. So this is Bernie, and he's the one you need to mention in chapter 15. So good luck next week. Good luck in your future, and I hope that you've gotten something out of this class besides a grade. Good luck in your future.